part two of the Northern Renaissance. So we are going to kind of continue our journey into the north. We're going to be moving into Germany as well as some Spanish northern artists. And we are going to begin our journey looking at an artist named Matthias Grunwald. In your notes, you can look at page 5 towards the bottom of the page, and it will go into two of the German masters that we'll be talking about in our Northern Renaissance Part 2 video. So our first artist is known for the Ischenheim altarpiece. His name is Matthias Grunwald, and his altarpiece that we are about to look at is from the Hospital of St. Anthony at Ischenheim, and it's specialized in treating patients with skin diseases. So it was in a monastery chapel, and it was a pilgrimage shrine, really, for those suffering from various skin diseases. So let's take a look at it. So this is the altarpiece, and this is actually the altarpiece when it is opened. Actually, I'm sorry, when it's closed. So this is the front area of the altarpiece, and this is bigger than some of the ones that we have looked at. If you look, it has a base, and then the 3 images on top. So like I said earlier, it is from a hospital for St. Anthony at the St. Anthony Monastery in Germany, and it was known for treating skin diseases. And at this monastery, they believed that all physical illness was a manifestation of a spiritual illness, and the first step to treat patients was to pray at the altarpiece placed in the choir of this church. So before we kind of move on into opening up the altarpiece and seeing what's inside, take a moment to think about, well, how is Christ portrayed here? And then have we ever seen him portrayed like this in any other way? So this is one of the first times, and if you want to hit pause and think about that, that's fine. But this is one of the first times that we see him on the cross. There's only really been 1 or 2 other times that we have seen this scene, which I'll show you in a moment. So if you look at Christ, his body is emaciated. The coloring of his skin is even off. And if you look at the bottom base of the altarpiece, his body is about to be placed in that tomb for which one day he will resurrect from. But you can even see there's some distortions or boils on his body caused by a skin infection. So much like the Röntgen Pietà, this image of Christ is made for people to know for them that God understood what they were going through. So, in the Röntgen Pietà, we saw a Mary, very emotional, with the very, very kind of explicit wounds of Christ. Here, we see Christ with wounds such as the ones that people in this hospital would have had. So it was meant to show them that God knows what you're going through, and if you just hold on and you are a good Christian, better things will happen. And the first time that we actually see Christ on a cross goes all the way back to Christian art in the 400s. And it was luxury art of Christ carved on a piece of ivory. And kind of very frontal, very linear, with a mix of kind of some Roman imagery and also some early Middle Age imagery. And we have Judas hanging from a tree there because he is killed later on. Now, if we look at closer up to these images of the Ischenheim altarpiece, it's this grotesque image, this very dark image. If you look at the background, the dominant color is dark just because of the plight of these people that were suffering from these skin infections. So you see that idea of intense suffering. It's very realistic because of the oil paint. Christ has boils and blood and marks all over his body. And then when partially opening the altarpiece, Christ's right arm almost looks like if it's amputated because of the way that it's open. And if you open one of the lower wings, it looks like part of his lower legs were amputated. And that was one of the ways that they kind of controlled skin infections on people, is they would amputate parts of the body that were infected. So who is pointing to Christ? Well, with the lamb the cross with the cross spouts blood from the chest into a chalice, shedding of Christ's blood almost like the sacrifice of a lamb. That's kind of what the connection to Jesus is. The symbolism of Jesus is there, and why the lamb is at the bottom. The figures on either side of Christ are Saint Sebastian, who is known as the Saint of Suffering. He is the one that has the arrows going through him. That's how he was executed. And on the other side is St. Anthony of Justice and Healing. I would write these down. I know they're not in red, but you do want to write them down. If you open up the altarpiece, now this is something that you don't necessarily have to know a lot about, but we see more images of Christ's life. We see the Annunciation scene on the far left-hand side. In the middle, we have the birth of Christ, and then on the far right-hand side, we have his resurrection. Okay, so those are all classic Christian scenes, but seen in a new Northern Renaissance style. And if you open it up even further, we have engravings and also some paintings, which these you do not have to know. But it's a very ornate piece with multiple layers. The pieces that you will have to know, though, are just the closed version of the altarpiece, where you see Christ with the skin boils, because that's where the context comes in for where it was created and why. So now on to our next German artist. His name is Albrecht Durer. So the image that you see here is one that you may have seen before. He is known as the Leonardo of the North. He actually goes and trains in northern Italy, and he brings back that humanist ideal of painting and mixes it with oil paint. So we see this frontal pose here. He looks like Jesus. His hand is almost held in blessing like Jesus, and it was a pose that was also reserved for Jesus. But what he's trying to do is he wants to raise the status of the artist. He believes that artists are not just like any other skilled craftsmen. They're not just like blacksmiths or carpenters or garment weavers. They have a special talent that comes from God, and that's what he's trying to do here. He's signing his name. It's the A with the D over it, okay, which is the way that he signed his name, which is something, again, we haven't seen a whole lot in art history where artists begin to sign their name. They want to be noticed. They want to be famous. He wants to be perceived as this Renaissance gentleman, and again, because of his use of oil paint, he's got very, very, very an extensive use of detail and the hair in his beard, the look of his eyes, the shadowing, the fur trim of his jacket. So very, very detailed here. Now, what do you have to know about Albrecht Durer? You have to know about the fall of man, which is an engraving. So an engraving, essentially, now we have the invention of the printing press in Northern Europe. It's invented by Johann Gutenberg, and what will happen is Albrecht Durer will become the first mass-produced artist. So what he does is he creates on a metal plate this image, and that turns that metal plate into a stamp that then can be reproduced over and over again on paper. So his images will be the first mass-produced images of any artist because they will be printed in these very early versions of Bibles. So he uses a lot of the Northern Renaissance symbolists that we've seen earlier. He also incorporates, though, that idea of humanism that he picked up in his study in Italy. So we see that as well. So again, this is an engraving. It depicts the original scene, and then it creates the original scene of original sin. So Eve about to take a bite of the apple from the tree of knowledge. And that is going to necessitate the coming of Christ, because Christ has to come back to forgive humanity of sin that is first started by Mary taking not Mary, but Eve taking a bite out of that apple. So it's created after Durer comes back from Italy. It was exposed to Greek and Roman sculpture. If you look at the bodies, they're very, very much very Greek and very Roman in the way that they are modeled. We have this attention to naturalism. You can see that on the fur of the cat. We see that for the mouse at the bottom. The goat represents the idea of lust. We see the goat kind of behind Adam over there, behind the tree. And we also have the cat and mouse game of Jesus and the devil, all right, trying to stop the devil, catch the devil. We also see contrapposto, so don't forget what the meaning of that is. Contrapposto of the figures, which is an influence of the Italian Renaissance on this northern artists. the ideal image of humans before the fall of man. They're both meant to be seen as beautiful, and then they will become ugly once they're cast out of the Garden of Eden. And if you continue to look at this, the mouse represents Satan. All right, Adam tries to dissuade Eve. He grasps the mountain, the mountain ash, a tree for which the snake is there, and the snake recoils. And at the bottom, we kind of really see this northern devotion to detailed painting with all of the various animals that are down below. This is another engraving that would have come at the end of the Bible. This is the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and this is seen in the book of Revelation. It was a woodcut, so a little bit different than the engraving. This would have been done in wood, but it would have been used as a stamp, just like a regular engraving would have been. Death rides on a skeletal horse. Famine, he is the one that is swinging the scales. Sickness is the one that is raising a sword. And war aims an arrow. Okay, and you see kind of at the bottom the priests that are there trying to stop the four horsemen of the apocalypse from coming. Now on to another German artist named Pieter Bruegel. So this image is not one that you have to know, but what do you have to know about Pieter Bruegel? He is a German artist. He is focused really on portraying the life of peasants. He traveled to Italy. He didn't really incorporate a whole lot of classical Italian Renaissance elements into his painting. The one way that we do see some classical Renaissance elements is in his landscapes. Because he traveled over the Alps, you often see mountains and large hills in his paintings, even though he really came from an area that was relatively flat. He focuses on the naturalism of the peasants themselves in terms of the life that they're living. They don't necessarily look real. The figures almost look cartoonish. And then also we see humanism being used on the peasants because of the way they're going about living their lives in a realistic way. And this is an example of genre painting. So it's a scene of everyday life. Make sure you know that what a genre scene is. Now, this is the piece that you do need to know for your images. It is a painting of hunters coming back from a really kind of unsuccessful hunt. And how do we know it's unsuccessful? The dogs all have their head down. The hunters have their heads down. And it is this very kind of depressing scene of these men whose duty it was to feed their families and feed their town are coming back without anything to eat. So the men doing their duty, but not too successfully. It looks like one of them has a rabbit or a squirrel over their back. They've only caught one animal. The dogs look emaciated. It is meant to kind of reflect the severe winter of 1565, which was a real event that took place. And you see the women over to the left of the men starting the fire, getting ready to cook. You've got other peasants on the lake down below getting ready to, or not getting ready, but a lot of them are ice skating and trying to have fun, even though this is a cold, bitter winter. And you have that alpine landscape, the mountains in the far right-hand corner that Pieter Bruegel would have experienced in his travels to Italy, but would not have really been in the area of Germany that Pieter Bruegel was living in. So we see here again, it's another genre scene. That's what he focused on. Pieter Bruegel, this was part of a scene of 6 to maybe even 12 paintings that are all represented various times of the year. So the painting before this represented the fall. This one obviously represents the winter, but he is incorporating oil painting with detail. Peasantry is being seen, and again, everyday life of the people living in this part of Europe in the 1500s. The landscape again has a kind of a high horizon line, which is a northern European tradition. The figures are peasant types; they're not individuals, and you can tell that they're not individuals because we don't really have the focus on anyone's face. So the details that we see, nothing seems to be static. The hunters had, not been very successful in this winter hunt, and their dogs are skinny and their heads are held downward. So not a good feeling overall coming about this. But you do have some happiness being seen with the people that are skating and kind of going about their life over on the frozen lake. A little bit closer there, you get a little bit more of the detail. You got some of the nature, some birds in the sky. You could tell that it's windy because the fire on the right hand or the left hand side looks as if it's blowing towards the left. So now on to a painting that is a direct reflection of the Protestant Reformation. So if you don't remember back to the Protestant Reformation of Germany, Martin Luther was a Catholic monk who was upset that the Catholic Church was selling something called indulgences. And essentially what an indulgence was is that you could pay the Catholic Church to be forgiven of your sins. This was seen as corrupt by Martin Luther. And he writes his 95 Thesis, which is his 95 problems that he has with the Catholic Church. And he nails it to the door of the cathedral in the town that he is living in. The church essentially gets very upset with him. They excommunicate him, and people will follow him. And his followers are called Protestants. They are protesting the Catholic Church. And because of this, the Protestant Reformation is going to lead to a schism in religious unity in Europe. So for the first time, really, since the start of the Catholic Church, there is a major breakaway and split of the Christian faith in Western Europe. You will now have the Catholic Church and you will now have the Protestant Church. And this image was created by Lucas Cranach the Elder, and it's called the Allegory of Law and Grace. And it was created really right after the start of the Protestant Reformation in 1530. So it is a woodcut, so something meant to be mass-produced, okay, on the printing press. We already talked about what the Protestant Reformation was, and this image is an example of Protestantism because you have the faithful, and one of the key tenets of being a Protestant was that the faithful achieve salvation by God's grace. Guidance can only be achieved by the Bible, okay? And it's not by paying an indulgence. It's not by going through the Catholic sacraments. It's not by church decree. It can only happen through the guidance of what the Bible actually says. And this image was done in consultation with Martin Luther, who was the leader of the movement. On the left-hand side, we see the Last Judgment. Okay, we've got Moses and the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments represent here in this image the old Catholic law, which is not good enough. It's not just good enough to get to heaven in order to lead you can't just get to heaven by leading a good life. On the right-hand side, the figure is bathed in Christ's blood, and the only way you can get to heaven is through Christ alone, and that is what is needed to get to heaven. Just your faith alone is what will get you. You can't just follow the Ten Commandments, which we see Moses over here. That will not get you to heaven. What will get you to heaven is the blood pouring from Christ's body over you and your faith. And again, that blood turns into the Holy Spirit, and that is what will get you into heaven and will get you saved. And we also see over to the far right-hand side on the bottom, the resurrection of Christ, the tomb opening up with Christ. All right, and now on to our final piece of art of the Northern Renaissance is a piece, though, that actually comes from Spanish artists living in the newly conquered area of the New World known as New Spain. And just by looking at this, you can tell that this is very much influenced by the Aztecs. And it's called the frontispiece of the Codex Mendoza, and it was created by the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So it was created by essentially the governor of this new colony that the Spanish have in Mexico. Created 1541 to 1542. It is ink on color paper, so this is not oil on canvas. So the scene depicts the founding of Tenochtitlan and the conquest of these two people at the bottom is what we see, these two major cities that the Aztecs will take over throughout their history. The skulls that are present, which you can see here on essentially on this bar, represent sacrificial victims, and it was intended as a history of the Aztecs that was going to be given to Charles V of the Roman Empire, because at this point Spain was being controlled by the Holy Roman Empire, and it only happens for a short period of time. That's also why the headpiece of Moctezuma, the feathered headdress, is actually in a German museum or an Austrian museum, because of the Holy Roman Empire controlling this part of the world at this time. It's named after Antonio de Mendoza, who is the Viceroy of New Spain, and it's created about 20 years after the conquest of the Aztecs. And the Aztecs do not create this. It's created with Aztec style. We have kind of these pictographs going around the corner of the book. And again, remember, it's meant to mimic the holy city and the capital city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan. We have the city being broken up into essentially four quadrants, okay, which is how the city was meant to be broken up because they believed there was four cardinal uh, directions, northeast, southwest. There were canals that broke the island apart into those four sacred quadrants. And if you look above the eagle, you actually see a kind of a replica of the Templo Mayor. And the story was that the sacred god of the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli, told the Aztecs that they leave their homeland, they will find a new homeland. And the way that they will know that they will have found this new homeland is there will be an eagle perched on top of a cactus that will be growing out of a rock. And they find this island in the middle of Lake Texcoco where they find an eagle perched on top of a cactus that is growing from a rock. And that's how they knew where their new homeland will be. And it's even on the Mexican flag today. So that's where that comes from. And then again, this is a historical piece to show who the people were that the Spanish had conquered, so that this could be sent back to the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Okay, and that takes us to the end of our Northern Renaissance unit, and we are going to pick up with the early Renaissance in our next chapter. See you guys, and have a good day.